Salut, salut. So, where did 907 come from? Well, I came across it completely by accident, actually. It was YouTube that shared a video with me or prompted me to watch a video. And I was literally just doing cleaning around the house, listening to this video. And I was like, wow, this answers so many questions. I kept stopping with the vacuum cleaner and with the polishing and so forth, just to stop and listen and make notes. And it was a 2 hour long lecture, and in the end, I just sat down and listened. And I've listened to that lecture many, many times now and found out a lot more about this linguist, Jacqueline Picoche, and started to connect it with my own experience of learning French and my experience 10,000 hours actually of teaching live French as well. So, and I also had a list of things that I was already seeking to solve, and so I had that in my mind as well when I was listening to it. So I heard this research. It was something that was radically different from anything that I'd ever heard before, but it really resonated with me on many, many levels. And so I thought, well, I have some really open-minded, uh, go for it kind of people that I teach, and I'm going to ask them if they would be prepared for me to experiment with this. It'd be an experiment for them to see whether or not that worked for them, and an experiment for me. And that's what we did first. And clearly the experiment worked because now the whole French room ethos and teaching and pedagogy and organization of every part of the French room is now built off of 907. So what happened in that experiment, and what did I learn? So when I came to the experiment, I had been teaching French for 10 years in a French room, much longer than that in other places, and always taken the approach of grammar first, conversation afterwards, and vocabulary picked up along the way, maybe a bit situational kind of vocabulary. And I'd really sort of like adopted, I suppose, the standard adult learning foreign language kind of approach, and it worked pretty well, really. So you might say, well, why were you even up for running an experiment? Because French Room has made successful French speakers really out of using that approach. But there were a couple of things that we were bumping up against too often, and I didn't really have a solution with by using that methodology. And I guess my radar was on to always constantly think about new, interesting ways to try to break through some of these issues that were coming up for my learners. And here they are. The first one was that translation stayed the default for really most of my learners. And so a person learning with me would think in English first and then enter French, and they'd get faster at it over time, but they would always be thinking as an English language speaker rather than a direct bilingual French speaker. And myself, when I was in Lyon, I only been there a couple of weeks before I decided the translation wasn't working for me, and I just dropped that as approach, and I really wanted that for my learners, but it was really hard to find a way to make that safe and credible, kind of and structured for them to be able to leave that behind. And the problem with translation is it slows you down in a moment. It makes you think in terms of English ways of sentences, so you never really fully engage with the language. But even more than that, it makes grammar unnecessarily complicated, and eventually it will rear itself as a frustrating plateau. And we all know what it's like to feel like when we plateau at something, and sometimes it feels like you're never going to break the ceiling again. So that was the first problem was really translation. The second one was, I suppose, a good problem to have. I've got such high achieving people that I work with that I could see that high achieving students were exhausting themselves and treating French and grammar like a syllabus to complete, level after level after level. And and really, grammar should serve us, the vocabulary should serve us, the language should serve us. But the way of thinking, in pretty much all French language courses is that, you constantly have to have that forward progress of moving up levels. Otherwise, you're not achieving. And the way to achieve that is to more intensively study grammar, more intensively, do this, and listening perhaps, and those sorts of things. And I didn't really want to put my students through that. I wanted them to really enjoy the process. And sometimes I felt like, it was becoming quite hard work for them. So that was in my mind, how to make this feel, after all, my mantra for the school has always been learn French, feel good. So how could I make that feel like that again? And then the third one was that French would always necessarily be a little bit robotic and a little bit distant from that person's actual personality. And some people say that you can be a different person in different languages, but that's a different thing from what I'm talking about here. I experienced someone speaking English was warm and friendly and articulate and, you know, making all sorts, well, just being that person. And then when we learned French through sort of like situational vocabulary lists, their personality couldn't come through. The language was always a little bit stilted, constantly observing, oneself while they're speaking. And what I really wanted was I really wanted to be able to give them sort of like little throwaway terms that they could use to really express, the ones that they wanted to express their own personality. So I had three things running through my mind when I discovered Picoche, which was by accident. And I suppose the thing that I immediately thought when I listened to her was that I was like, why has nobody told me about this before? And that's a bit like my experience when I was in Lyon. Somebody showed me Le Béchirel after I'd done my studies in French in England, and I was like, nobody showed me this before. This is fantastic. It's a bit like, wow, this is the missing piece, or this is the hidden structure, or this is the thing that has been my blind spot, and suddenly, it's opened up. So that's how it felt for me. And then what became really obvious straight away when I started running the experiment, and I started running it through Rendezvous Tuto and then running it into live classes a little bit. And that's just, started quite small, it was prototyping really. And but very quickly it became obvious that we were starting inside French. And so, that was good because that meant that we didn't need to translate. But you can't just sort of like say switch off translation if that's what you've been doing for the last, 10, 5, 50 years, however long you've been working on your French. You can't just say just switch that off. And also, what do you replace it with? But actually, what we found in the experiment was that actually the alternative was solid enough, concrete enough to hold up as an alternative to translation. And that's the first time in my life that I've ever seen something where I can give a structure to people which is alternative to translation, where they can feel comfortable, move around, and start to trust themselves in French. So that was a massive um, good point. Um, Also, obviously, people I teach, highly intelligent, successful people, and they're a bit skeptical, about this. Skeptical but open and prepared to give it a try, but open about their skepticism as well, which I really, really appreciated actually, and fair questions. We've always done things from the point of view of grammar, Ellie. Why would we not start? Why would we start with vocabulary? And vocabulary seems like such a mass, and so disorganized. And I heard things like, "I'm a linear learner. Sorry, this feels too messy, or this feels too basic," because I took people right back to really simple words to begin with, like être and avoir. And if you've been learning for a while, that might seem like a bit of a retrograde step. And what about all the breadth and the vocabulary I've already accumulated? What happens then? It seems really limited. I don't want to pull myself down to just one verb. Why would I do that when I know so much else? So all of those things were really good challenges. And the fantastic thing was that the experiment actually could test each of those out and start to see, well, actually, does it fail on any of these points? And it didn't, which was very reassuring because we really were testing this. And then I could see, that the ideas behind Picoche, I'd already noticed this when I listened to her, that I'd been using this when I was in Lyon. I'd been in France, and I was really working off of what I already knew. And I was seeing language sort of like accumulate and build off of centers of gravity that I already knew. And 907 gives you that too. And what I did was personal to me and is my French. And what I was seeing in the experiment was that as people were starting to build off of their own centers of gravity, their own ingenuity and creativity came out. And I was blown away by some of the things. I still am, every time I teach, and somebody comes and brings something that's really personal to them around a center of gravity, i.e., a 907 word. I would think, gosh, I never thought of it like that, and I would learn from them as well. And so that really, I suppose, challenges the very common myth, that you have to live in France or, a French-speaking language in order to learn it properly. No, I've never believed that. I haven't lived in France for 30 years. But what I do believe is you need to not live in the country, but you need to inhabit the language and feel the language. And this is what 907 experiment showed us that we did. Other things that we found out was that, just the idea of a cahier was quite nebulous and actually had to be pinned down by each individual. And then we found that some people wanted to do it digitally, some people wanted to do it on scraps of paper, other people bought various books, some people bought flip charts, post-its. And actually, it's a really, really personal thing. But everything, what was a feature of all of them was that it became iterations and a work in progress, if you like, rather than, some neat lists. And then the idea of bank or borrow actually gave us a sense of relief that I don't need to know every single word in French, and that actually only a word that really deserves and merits its position in my cahier that I can really feel goes in. So it's not then about volume, but it's about quality. So let's say I should have said it's quality, not quantity, which then resolved obviously the issues of high achieving students not wanting to always highly achieve and going from level, and in fact. But accumulating more and more and more grammar, but finding that the grammar wasn't really doing the job for them. And then this is one surprising, maybe the most surprising. I don't know really. I mean, it's all been very surprising. But, for example, if you take a verb like a word like prendre, I've had people talk just with almost, using prendre as the center of gravity of what they've been talking about for 3 or 4 minutes and use it 20 times and it doesn't sound repetitive. In fact, it sounds actually quite measured and controlled. So if I just sort of like come back, I'm just going to come back and have a look. What was it that I was trying to resolve with translation staying as a default? Well, inhabiting the language and understanding the language from inside the words actually removes the need to translate, but replaces it with a concrete system that is reliable enough to trust. High achieving students exhausting themselves, going level by level by level, that's challenged by the fact that actually you can take it at your own pace. The cahier takes the pressure off of you, and you are encouraged to take time on each word because each word will yield you so much and give you so much sort of like relaxed French that you don't actually feel like actually ticking the next box off of the subjunctive or whatever is necessarily the next thing to do. And actually, interestingly, this is an interesting thing that got turned on its head was that, in academic French learning, people always sort of like see the subjunctive as the pinnacle of French fluency. When I started speaking French in France, that wasn't really the biggest issue I had. I think masculine and feminine was probably a bigger issue for me. And do after verbs, perhaps another one. There are plenty of things, pronunciation, plenty of things, but subjunctive wasn't. And interestingly, since the experiment happened, I noticed that most of the students who took part in the experiment, and it really doesn't matter how long they've been learning French or where their level is in terms of live classes, they're all using the subjunctive because it feels natural now. We're not thinking about it as an intellectual exercise, as a grammar point. We're just saying, well, that fits there. That fits there. Il faut que je prenne. I'll just use it. And actually, they're finding it as easy as I did. And then the last thing that I wanted to achieve was I wanted to help people to become more them in French. And for example, exploring c'est and then an adjective, c'est bien, c'est super, and being able to give people reactions at such a sort of like a simple level actually helps people to inject personality really from a very, very early point in their French. So this is what I found out from the experiment, and needless to say, then what happened next was that I decided to adopt this as the entire pedagogical base of the French room in 2026. Merci d'avoir écouté. Au revoir.